It's a real pleasure to introduce Professor Kathleen Segerson to you today. She's the Board of Trustees Distinguished Professor of Environmental and Resource Economics at the University of Connecticut. Her BA and PhD in economics are from Dartmouth and Cornell, respectively. And at UConn, she's jointly appointed also in agricultural and resource economics and environmental engineering. So like a truly interdisciplinary scholar. Former president of the Association of Environmental and Resource Economics, and a fellow of the Agricultural and Applied Economics Association. From 2017 to 2022, she also was Associate Dean of the Graduate School at UConn, so multiple talents. As talents and contributions more pertinent to her talk today, she has served on many national and international advisory committees. This includes IASA, the International Institute of Applied Systems Analysis in Vienna, where she was on the US National Member Organization Committee, at the Bayer Institute for Ecological Economics in Stockholm, where actually I got to know her very well. She has been on the Scientific Advisory Board, many national academic committees, too numerous to mention, and really sustained involvement with the EPA in the United States. She was on the Science Advisory Board, the Chartered Executive Board, and then from 2003 to 2009 on the Valuing the Protection of Ecological Services and Systems Committee, where she co-authored the influential 2005 report on valuing ecosystem services. Author of 5 books, many articles, but let's get on to her talk today, which is on designing effective environmental and conservation policies, the role of collective incentives.
So thank you very much for that introduction, Elke, as well as for the invitation to be here today. It's a real pleasure. I'm looking forward to talking to you a little bit about an area of research that I've been involved in for many years. And you'll see this is in some sense a synthesis of some of the work that I've been doing across a variety of contexts. So I'm looking forward to sharing it with you as well as to your comments and questions afterwards. So let me start with a recognition that probably many of you are already familiar with, and that is the increased understanding or awareness about human and nature interconnection. So we sometimes hear this referred to as the coupled human-natural systems perspective. That is something that has emerged over the last couple of decades and I think is now permeating, hasn't quite gotten into economics yet, but it's permeating many other disciplines to a large extent. And so this diagram just essentially shows that humans rely critically on ecosystems for many services, for many goods, and in turn, the nature or the ecosystems provide a lot of services to humans. So there are humans impacting nature and nature impacting humans. And so there's this coupled relationship that's really important for recognizing both in terms of the interdisciplinary scholarship, but even in terms of people who are working on individual components of this coupled system. So as a result of this increased recognition, we've seen a lot of improvement in environmental quality indicators over the last couple of decades. This just shows you some of the improvements in terms of reductions in water pollution, air pollution that have occurred as a result of this increased recognition and to a large extent to policies that have resulted from that. Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, et cetera. So this change is something that's I think, very important to recognize, but there are also some things that haven't changed. We obviously still continue to have a number of very challenging environmental problems before us, and so part of the question we might ask is, what is it that continues to challenge us in terms of trying to address the environmental problems that we have? And so I'm an economist, so I think about this from an economic perspective, and think about 2 fundamental principles of economics that I think underlie many of the problems that we face today. So the first of these is that decisions respond to incentives, and those can be incentives to do something good or incentives to do something bad. And so clearly, from my perspective, what I'm interested in is trying to design incentives to encourage people to do things that are good, and in particular good from an environmental perspective. But in doing so, it's important to recognize the second part of this, the second fundamental principle, and that is that firms or individuals care about their own self-interest. I'm not suggesting that's the only thing they care about, and it'd be important and interesting to have a conversation, and I hope we can at during the Q&A about some of the other things that might be influencing decisions. But certainly self-interest is one of those things that's important. And so designing incentives to ensure that when actors, whether it's firms or individuals, are acting in their own self-interest, they're also acting in the interest of environmental protection. That's really what part of the objective is here. So fundamental to this idea is the concept of externalities, which many of you may already be familiar with, but let me just reiterate for those of you who perhaps aren't familiar with this terminology that's ubiquitous in economics, particularly in environmental economics. And it's this term of externalities. So what does that mean? It means that impacts of human activities are often external to the party undertaking the activity, whether that party is individuals or firms. So some of the things that we as individuals do on a daily basis can have external impacts on other parties, even if it's just driving your car, taking a long hot shower, all those kind of individual things that we do that impact energy consumption and therefore can impact environmental quality through emissions, etc. So as individuals, we're having an impact on other people, environmental impact, and firms do as well. Of course, the firms are obviously engaging in different kinds of production activities that are impacting air quality, water quality on a regular basis. So why do they do this? Well, partly it's in response to these self-interested motivations. Exploitation of the resource or the environment provides some sort of short-run gain to those parties, right? And they often have little or at least insufficient incentive to protect or restore the environment or the ecosystem services. So this existence of externalities, the existence of these external effects that aren't otherwise being taken into consideration by the individuals or the firms that are making the decisions, these provide a fundamental rationale for policy. So I know this is a policy school, and so from an economic perspective, we often think about externalities as a fundamental driver of the need for environmental policy, the need for governments, whether it be at the international level, the national level, regional, local level, to step in and try to provide some way to correct these external impacts that are being suffered by various populations. This graph, or this figure, basically is a way of putting this idea and this policy perspective into the broader perspective of valuing ecosystem services. So if we think about just starting at the upper left-hand corner here, essentially what I've just said is that we can have policy decisions that will provide incentives that impact the decisions that firms are making, that individuals and firms are making. So these incentives then cause them, hopefully, the idea is that it would cause them to change their actions. Those actions would impact ecosystems. The impact on ecosystems will have an impact on ecological production functions and the ecosystem services that those ecosystems provide, and that those changes in ecosystem services will generate benefits and costs for individuals or for the environment more generally, if that's primarily what your focus is, if you have a non-anthropocentric view of a concern for environmental protection. Right? So this is just a broader framework. What I'm going to focus on today is really that number one arrow, how policy decisions can affect decisions by individual firms through creating incentives. So what do I mean by policies in this context? So typically when we think about policies, we think about policies that are applied at the level of the party that's engaging in the offending activity or generating the beneficial activity. So we think about individualized policies. So in the context of firms, these might be things like carbon taxes, imposing a carbon tax on the production of, say, electricity from fossil fuels, or discharge regulations, trying to regulate discharges, whether it be into the air or into the water. And even renewable energy subsidies are a form of individualized, to a large extent, type of incentive. So they're targeted toward individual firms or individual who are engaging in that offending activity. There are also individual policies for landowners, land use restrictions. So if we have zoning or if we have restrictions on what you can do with your land, those also are often targeted, again, at the individual landowner. In a fisheries context, which is another context I've been interested in, there are individual harvest or bycatch limits, again, imposed at an individual vessel level, typically. And then for individuals, purchase decisions that you're making about, say, buying electric vehicles and receiving subsidies, all of these are focused on individuals. So what I'm interested in are instead, not instead necessarily, but in complementary manner with what I call group level policies. So what does this mean? It means policies that are targeted not necessarily to individuals, but to a group, okay? So I'm interested in whether or not we can incentivize some form of collective action to reduce third-party externalities. By third-party, I mean impacts outside of the group. You can have groups where there are externalities within the group. One member of the group is doing something that's impacting another member of the group. But I'm primarily interested in contexts where what the group as a whole is doing is impacting somebody outside of the group, because the incentives there are quite different than they are for controlling externalities within the group. I put the word collective action in quotes here because even though we can think about this and it's often referred to as collective action, it's distinct in many ways, or can be distinct from a group that collectively decides on something. So the decisions are not necessarily collective in the context that I'm thinking about, even though we think of it as trying to induce collective action. So it's in this way that this is distinct from what sometimes referred to as collective management or self-governance to address the tragedy of the commons. Because if we have, for instance, a resource that's owned collectively, but all of the impacts of using that resource are felt by members within the group, then you can have this collective management, self-governance to try to address those resource issues and make sure that the group as a whole is able to effectively manage the resource that they own or control. Again, just to emphasize, my context is a little different from that because I'm interested in cases where the group is doing something that impacts somebody outside of the group. So again, in terms of incentives, they might have an incentive to control actions that impact them internally, but not necessarily to control actions that impact externally. So that's the distinction I'm drawing here. So what are some examples? And I draw from a wide variety of examples across a wide variety of contexts. So there are examples in air quality and water quality standards. There are examples in agricultural non-point source pollution. There are examples in the context of payments for ecosystem services, in the context of fisheries for quotas on harvest or bycatch that are set collectively at a group level rather than individual level. There's something what I refer to as industry-wide regulatory threats. And then there's a concept known as joint and several liability for hazardous waste cleanup. And I'll give more detail on what these examples are in these various contexts in a minute. But what I want to point out first is that this is also a concept or an idea that has applicability outside of the environmental realm. So there are lots of non-environmental examples where the structure of the problem is very similar to what it is in the context that I'm interested in. So I just give a couple of examples here. So often, like in an industry, you might, or in a company, you might have a team that is charged with a particular task, like development of a new product. And it may be that rather than rewarding the individuals within the team, you seek to reward the team as a whole through like a bonus to the team if they accomplish whatever the goal is in terms of product development or innovation. Profit sharing in law firms or medical practices are also very similar to this. So essentially, what you have is that when any individual within the group, they can contribute to the profitability of the group as a whole, but the profitability of the group as a whole benefits everybody in the group, not just the person that led to that increase in business activity, for instance. Employee ownership schemes are very similar as well. So they're an example where if employees own a particular business, then when the business does well, the employees do well, even if they aren't the individuals who have contributed to that particular dimension of the improved performance of the firm. So those are some examples that are in a industry context, if you will. Coming back to an academic context, I like to use the example of team projects in classrooms because I think many of us are familiar with either assigning or being a part of a team project in a class that you've taken or that you've taught. And in this context, what we often do is we grade based on the team performance. So we give a single grade to the entire team rather than giving individual grades to the members of the team. And if this example resonates with you, you can maybe keep it in mind as we go through, because many of the types of incentives that I'm interested in are evident in this context as well. So for instance, when you have a group project in your class, you have to think about whether there are people within the group who are shirking, right, and just trying to essentially rely on other people in the group to do the work. So that's part of the challenge that you face when you have group projects. But group projects can also provide an opportunity for students to learn from each other, to have complementary skills, so the coordination and the cooperation between them can be very productive and very enhancing. So this is sort of a fundamental trade-off that we think about when we think about using group-level policies, in this case group projects, in an educational context. But as I said, that idea extends beyond the classroom context. And that will be fundamental to the context we'll talk about today. Microfinance in developing countries is just one other example where this idea has been used. So going back to the environmental examples, let me just run through some of those categories that I talked about and tell you what I mean by group policies in these different contexts. So one is in the context of ambient air or water quality standards. So as many of you undoubtedly know, the Clean Air Act has the National Ambient Air Quality Standards, and these are basically ambient standards that are based on ambient air quality. And they are, in some sense, a group reward or punishment policy, if you will, in the sense that it's the entire contributions of all of the entities who are contributing to pollution in that particular attainment or non-attainment area that are responsible for the overall performance of that area, and then are either penalized or rewarded for that overall performance. So these NAQUAs have generally been viewed as being fairly effective in terms of reducing ambient air pollution. In contrast, on the water side, there are TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, under the Clean Water Act, which essentially require there to be some recognition of the loadings that are discharged into a particular water body. But there are no clear penalties for failure to meet these limits, or for the most part, state authority to regulate non-point pollution, which is a big contributor to water quality problems in certain locations. So these TMDLs have generally not been particularly effective, and so part of the question we might ask is, why have they been effective in the context of air quality and not in the context of TMDLs and water quality? So this is one context. Agricultural non-point source pollution is another one. So in the agricultural context, pollution is often diffuse, meaning it's running off of a field as opposed to coming out of the end of a pipe. And this can be difficult to monitor, and therefore difficult to impose things like taxes or regulations on the end discharges. It's often easier to monitor ambient water quality in a particular stream or in a particular lake. And so there's been a suggestion, and this is some of my earlier work that I was quite interested in, whether or not we could use tax or reward policies that were based not on individual performance, but on the performance of the collective of the individual farmers who are in a particular, say, watershed or contributing to water quality or water pollution in a particular lake or stream. There's been relatively little actual application of this idea, but there is an example in Florida, the Florida Agricultural Privilege Tax, which basically was a tax that was levied on agricultural land in the Everglades agricultural area, and the tax rate is based on ambient phosphorus in the lake, and the tax rate is reduced through credits when the phosphorus loadings are reduced. So even if you aren't the person who was responsible for that reduction, you can still benefit from the overall reduction in the ambient level of phosphorus in the Lake Okeechobee in this case. So that's an example in the agricultural context. There's a lot of work in the PES world, Payments for Ecosystem Services, on how to design effective payment schemes. And in some cases, those payments have been designed to go not to individual landowners, but to collectives, like a village or some other group. So for instance, in Ecuador, there's examples of payments for hydrological and, payments for limiting grazing that were made, the payments were made to communities that owned or had communal land rights. In Mexico, There's an example of payments for hydrological and biodiversity services made to communities that collectively own their own land. Sweden, there's an example of conservation of wolverines and lynx populations where the villages were rewarded when the population as a whole was maintained. And so, again, not based on any individual landowners or harvesters' contribution to that, but on the collective impact on the resource as a whole. And then even in the context of carbon offsets, some payments now are being made to governments, like Norway's payments to Brazil through the Amazon Fund are again an example of a payment to a group, in this case the Brazilian government, that represents a collective of individual landowners within Brazil. So that's a second context. A third one is in the context, as I mentioned, of fisheries, where in some cases, quotas are issued to individual vessels, but there are many examples where quotas are instead issued to a collective. It can be a cooperative. In many cases, it's a cooperative. And those quotas can be harvest quotas or they can be bycatch quotas. So harvest quotas, an example is the Alaskan Chignik Salmon Fishery Cooperative. That is something that it no longer exists, but it was an early example of issuing quota to a cooperative rather than to individual vessels. The New England groundfish sectors is very similar. That does still exist, and that's one where the collective, meaning the cooperative, the sector, is issued quota that they then internally control and try to regulate within the vessels that are members of the sector. This can be done also at the bycatch level, not just the harvest level. So I was particularly interested in sea turtle bycatch, where there was a limit on sea turtle bycatch in the Hawaiian longline swordfish fishery, but there weren't enough bycatch allowances to issue even one to each firm. And so what they essentially did is they said for the fleet as a whole, we're going to have a limit, and when the fleet reaches the limit, the fishery will be closed down. So you're penalized as a whole for reaching the aggregate limit that was based on, in some sense, aggregate performance. Okay. And then I mentioned this notion of industry-wide regulatory threats. There have been examples where a regulator can essentially threaten an industry, if you will, with imposition of a costly tax or regulation if the industry as a whole doesn't meet certain types of goals or targets for environmental improvement. So there are examples in the metal finishing industry, in the energy industry, the UK climate change agreements. The chemical industry's responsible care program is not something that was generated by regulatory necessarily threats, but very similar when you're trying to induce some kind of reputational gains, where those reputational gains are going to depend upon not just your individual performance, but the performance of the group as a whole. And then finally, in the context of hazardous waste cleanup, some of you may be familiar with the Superfund legislation that the interpretation of it imposed joint and several liability for hazardous waste cleanup. And essentially what this requires is that any one potentially responsible party may be held liable for the entire cleanup of the site when that harm caused by those multiple parties can't be separated, so individual liability can't be assigned. And so potentially responsible parties, it's defined quite broadly to include not only current owners and operators, but past owners and operators. This was very controversial at the time, real concern about the impacts of imposing joint and several liability, but it is an example where you're essentially holding a collective group of people responsible for performance that they may individually have contributed relatively little to. Okay, so why do this? Why use this kind of a group approach? So there are a lot of different examples of why you might want to use a group approach. Joint or non-separable production is one example. That's probably most likely relevant in the context of hazardous waste sites, as I said, where you may not be able to separate out attribution. Monitoring individual contributions can be costly. Non-point source pollution is an example of that. Contracting with many small landowners may be prohibitively costly. The PES programs that are for collections of landowners are based to a large extent on this contracting cost argument. The resource may be owned or managed collectively. Again, communal land ownership would give a rationale for why you might want to then have a communal payment or reward system. But on top of that, it's also possible that what you're trying to do is to foster some kind of coordination. For instance, in the fishing context, you want to foster spatial or temporal coordination among the different vessels that's not possible when you're using individualized incentives. It can encourage information sharing about hotspots for bycatch, for example. You can imagine in the group project within your class example, this is the concept of individuals within the group having different expertise or different knowledge that they can share collectively. And it's also possible that using this kind of an approach can pool or smooth risks when outcomes are uncertain, because you're essentially pooling the uncertainty into a single pool. Okay. What's the problem? So those are some of the reasons you might want to do this. What's the problem? Well, as I mentioned, again, thinking about the shirking issue, that each group member's own costs and or benefits depend not only on their own actions, but also on the actions of others. And so essentially what it means is that if you have a shared reward for group performance or a shared penalty for bad performance, then the benefits or the costs of that are shared by all, but the costs of achieving better performance are fully borne by the individuals. And so this creates some kind of an incentive to shirk, right? Because you're incurring all of your individual costs, but not getting as much of the individual benefit as would be warranted if you were being rewarded individually. Okay? So again, benefits are fully reaped by individuals in many cases. When you have shared limits, costs are spread across the group in that case. So it's kind of the flip side of what I said before. But in either case, the implication is that there's an incentive to shirk, or what we often refer to as free ride in economics, on the efforts of others. So again, in the group context of a project for a class, trying to let other people do the work, and you get the benefit in the sense of you get the payoff, the good grade, even though you didn't contribute much to the effort. So this creates that kind of an incentive. And in a tragedy to of the commons type of context, it also can create a race to fish. Basically, if there's a cap that's applied to a group as a whole, you want to get your share before the cap runs out. And so you have an incentive for people to race to fish, to try to get the resource before the other people in the group get it. So these are some of the problems associated with these types of approaches. And so the question that I'm interested in is, can we design policies to try to discourage or avoid shirking while at the same time trying to promote the type of cooperation, the type of learning within the group that you think you would want to promote? So how, if at all, can we design policies to avoid that shirking but encourage the cooperation? And again, individual penalties would avoid the shirking if you could do them, but they wouldn't encourage the cooperation. So even in the context where you might be able to use an individual penalty, you might still choose or want to think about a group approach. So the way in which you could structure these incentives, and by incentives I mean either rewards or penalties, so they can be positive things, carrots, negative things, sticks. The way in which you would structure them can take various forms. And so I look particularly at two different structures here. One is what I refer to as proportional rewards or penalties. So the idea here is that if you have some target level that you're trying to achieve, and the group as a whole achieves beyond that target, where the target is a good thing, then you can be rewarded in a way that's proportional to the amount by which you exceed the target. Conversely, if you fall below, you would be penalized proportionally to the amount by which you fall below. So these are proportional rewards or penalties, right? In contrast, fixed rewards or penalties are based on you either meet or you don't meet. So if you meet, you get a fixed reward, regardless of whether you meet it by a little bit or a lot. And if you fall below, if it's a penalty, if you fall below, you get penalized, regardless of whether you fall below by a small amount or a large amount. So the amount of the penalty or the reward is not proportional to the amount by which you deviated from the target. And so there are lots of examples that fall into either of these two categories. So on the proportional side, there's something called deemed values in fisheries in New Zealand. Essentially, if you have quota and you meet your use up all your quota and you want to go beyond, you can buy more quota. So buying more quota allows you basically to pay a price to exceed your quota that's available. There was a Long Island Sound nutrient trading program that had a very similar structure. And per unit payments in the context of ecosystem services are also of this type. So if you're paying, say, per acre then of avoided deforestation, then you are paying proportional to the amount of acreage that you keep under forestry. Okay. In contrast, as I said, examples of the fixed reward are when you have, for instance, a closure of a fishery when you reach or exceed a particular limit. So a bycatch limit, for instance, it's like it doesn't matter how much you exceeded it by, you shut down the fishery when you get there. And regulatory threats are also of this nature because when the industry fails to meet some kind of a standard or an expectation, then if you have imposition of a costly policy, whether it be a tax or a regulation or whatever, it's a kind of an all or nothing type of response to that failure to meet the expectation or the target that you were shooting for. Okay. So as you can imagine, once you set up this type of a group structure, though, this type of a collective reward or punishment, then how effective it is, how well it works, depends very much on the structure of the group. And so I mentioned here just a couple of things that are important in this regard. So one is how the group makes decisions, and in particular, whether it is a decentralized or a centralized group. So by that I mean, in a centralized group, you might have a single body within the group that's making the decisions and telling everybody else in the group what they need to do. Right? Whereas in a decentralized context, you might simply be allowing everybody to make their own decisions, and you hope that you've set the structure up so that they are all contributing to the overall goal of meeting the target. So how those within group decisions are made can be critical in terms of how effective the group structure is. Group size also becomes important. Larger groups can make cooperation more difficult. They also, of course, make the possibility for sharing and coordination in some sense more desirable because you've got more heterogeneity within the group, so you can take advantage of that. But the larger the group, the more difficult it can be to get cooperation, the more likely it is that someone won't feel like their contribution is pivotal. The example I always use in my class is, contributions to public radio. If you don't contribute to public radio, the likelihood that public radio, if you yourself don't contribute, is going to disappear is probably pretty low, so you don't consider your contribution to be pivotal. Whereas if you were the only one contributing, you might consider it to be more pivotal, you might be more likely to contribute. Another critical thing is within group monitoring and accountability to reduce free riding. Can you somehow identify people within the group that are not, in some sense, holding their own, are not making the contributions they could? There are a variety of mechanisms to try to ensure accountability, exclusion, certification, some kind of regulatory relief only for those who meet individualized targets, etc. Those can be effective means for within group accountability, but first you need to be able to monitor, so that's a critical component as well. And then questions about how the resources, and in particular if there are rewards or penalties, how those are shared within the group. So a perception that these sharing rules are fair is really important for purposes of having an effective group structure. And then a really critical one is within group expectations and trust, so basically trusting the other members within the group. So you might recognize these as being similar to, related to, Elinor Ostrom's design principles for CPR management for collective action. I've just summarized some of those design principles here, and there is a lot of similarity and parallelism between the types of things that you would think would make for an effective group policy of the type I'm talking about, and the effectiveness of group management or collective action in the context where you have the resource is collectively managed by the group without any spillover effects to the outside. As I said before, here the key difference between my context and that context is that the resource that you're trying to manage here is a resource that's effectively a group allocation from like a regulator, for instance, right? So you've got an external body that's setting the overall target for you rather than the group as a whole determining their own target. And the reason why that's important is because, again, in the context I'm interested in, these are contexts where there are spillover impacts outside of the group. So it's not just, you can't just leave it to the group to do everything on their own. So what are some of the general conclusions that come out of the theory? So 2 things here. One is that these collective rewards or penalties are most likely to be effective when they're designed to provide strong incentives in a cost-effective way. So one of the problems with TMDLs is that there is no underlying structure to provide a strong incentive for compliance with the TMDLs, unlike under the Clean Air Act. And so that's one possible explanation for why we see such a difference in effectiveness in that particular context. But in general, if there aren't strong incentives, then it's not going to be obviously an effective mechanism for trying to correct those spillover effects to those third parties. Right? But the second big takeaway is that policies that require coordination within the group, for those policies, the group needs to create mechanisms to facilitate and to enforce coordination within the group. So you need to have mechanisms in place that build things like trust, that have monitoring, that have accountability, et cetera, to ensure that we can avoid those shirking or those free riding problems that are often plaguing these kinds of group approaches. So this is what comes out of the theory on this. There's a lot of empirical evidence that has also tried to look at how effective these types of mechanisms are in practice. And so I just divide the empirical work into 4 categories here: lab studies, field studies, case studies, and observational studies. And I'll just briefly mention what I mean by these and what these studies have found. So lab studies are typically studies in a lab in typically a university using students as subjects. There have been a number of studies, particularly in the agricultural context, that have looked at the effectiveness of these policies when they've been studied in the lab. There have been field studies that take that idea to the field, where the participants, instead of being students sitting in a lab, the participants are instead actual resource owners. So farmers or landowners, coffee mill operators in Costa Rica, local villages in a variety of places, forest users in some developing countries, et cetera. So these types of field studies are very similar to the lab studies, except that the participants in the study are not students, but rather actual practitioners. And so what do these studies find? They find that proportional rewards and penalties tend to work better than fixed ones, mainly because there are fewer coordination issues with trying to just meet the limit. So the marginal incentives that are created by the proportional approach can be more effective than the all or nothing approach that requires more coordination within the group. Open channels of communication can help in getting the group to work cooperatively together to coordinate, but it can also lead to collusion. And so to the extent that you're concerned about collusive behavior and negative impacts of collusive behavior, that's a downside to having very open communication channels within the group. And performance improves with increased trust. So basically strong internal governance and leadership have been shown to be important, and with in-group participation in developing rules. So basically things that the Ostrom principles would have told us, again in a different context, but would have told us are important things for good group effectiveness work here as well. What about case studies? Mainly, most of these have been in the context of fishing cooperatives, as I mentioned, and so they've looked at actual fisheries policy where quota has been allocated to cooperatives and seen how effective that has been in trying to manage the fishery. And they've shown, these variety of studies have shown that the collective use of quota or caps has been effective in reducing the race to fish, has been effective in increasing the sharing of information about hotspots, technology, et cetera. Enforcement of gear restrictions, enhancing product quality because of better spatial and temporal coordination, protecting habitat, reducing financial risks, et cetera. But again, all of this depends on the ability to limit free riding, which depends, again, comes back to the question of the need for monitoring and enforcement of the internal rules. Observational studies, these are studies of the type where you would look at what's actually happening on the ground and compare it to a counterfactual of what would have happened in the absence of the policy. So often comparing a treatment group to a control group and seeing whether the performance of the treatment group is better than the performance of the control group, where the treatment group here would be the group that would be subject to the group approach, the group penalty. And so much of this has been done in the context of collective PES programs. As I mentioned here, reduced deforestation in Mexico, shared grazing land in Ecuador, wildlife conservation in Sweden, all contexts in which there have been observational studies of the impacts of these approaches. There's also been study of fishing cooperatives that's been more general as opposed to just the case studies I mentioned before, and some work on the impact of regulatory threats. Right? And so these, again, have shown results that are generally consistent with the theory that the approach, particularly a proportional approach, can be very effective, but you can also have coordination problems. So it's not a panacea by any stretch. I just have a caveat at the bottom here about these observational studies, because this is something I've also been quite interested in, and that is that using an approach where you essentially compare the performance of treated groups to participants, to control groups, non-participants, and use that as an indication of the effectiveness of the program, can actually lead to bias when you have programs that have spillover effects. And so just a word of caution about the interpretation of those kinds of studies that use that kind of a comparison to identify the impact of the treatment, in this case, the group approach. And again, all of this shows that governance within the group is key. So the empirical literature shows the importance of strong social capital, of leadership, of community engagement, of tradition, and a history of cooperation and trust as being critical components of effectiveness here. An interesting paper by Hayes et al., I think, suggests that this relationship may in fact be reciprocal, that good local or within group governance can enhance the effectiveness or the success of group incentives, but that group incentives can also provide an incentive to generate good governance. And so you can have this essentially a reciprocal relationship here that goes in both directions. So in summary, because I think I should end by 1, right, Elke, so we can have time for questions? Okay, good, so I'm right on schedule. So in summary, group-based policies have been used in a wide variety of contexts, both environmental and natural resource management. And so for this reason, I suggest that we should be viewing these as part of the policy toolkit, if you will, in addition to individualized policies of the standard tax and regulation subsidy type of approaches. But of course, they do create a collective action problem. There are incentives to cooperate, but also incentives to free ride. And so what are the key conditions for these approaches to be successful? Generally speaking, there are 2. One is strong external incentives. Internal incentives are not going to be sufficient if there are spillovers to third parties. So we need to have strong external incentives imposed by policy that are based on monitoring of group performance, and strong and enforceable carrots or sticks, it can go either way, to ensure incentives to comply with those standards that are being set, or those caps that are being imposed. And then the second one is mechanisms to facilitate or enforce coordination, either formally, maybe there are contracts among members of the group, but often it's informal, based on trust and social norms and peer pressure, et cetera. So these are the 2 key essential elements, conditions under which we would expect these types of group approaches to be effective. So for anyone who's interested, much of what I've talked about today is based just on a review paper that came out not too long ago. This is the reference to it. And other than that, thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions, or if people just have general comments or feedback.
I'm curious to learn a little bit more about how within the group they address the problem of shirkers. So if you were to pick any of the examples that you've looked at, say the bycatch limits imposed on a given fishery in Alaska, what have the members of the group done to sort of take it down to the level of the individual operator?
So let me answer that in two ways. Am I okay standing here? Okay, let me answer that in two ways. So in the context of fisheries, one possibility is that the collective takes the collective cap and literally allocates it to members of the group. Okay, catch shares, yes. So but then they have rules in place where they say, for instance, that different members can only fish in certain locations on certain times. So they use some internal rules for how that catch can be, that the individual catch shares can then be used to try to facilitate the coordination. So that's one example in the context of fisheries. Now, in the context of agricultural non-point source pollution, the work that I've done suggests that you can actually structure the incentive mechanism, set up the rewards and the penalties in such a way that even when each individual acts on its own self-interest in a Nash equilibrium, you can create an incentive for them not to shirk. Right? I don't know if you're familiar with this, but there's a literature on team production from Bent Holmstrom that goes way back to the 1980s, and he talks about trying to design compensation mechanisms in such a way that you avoid shirking, and it's all about how do you set the marginal, it doesn't have to be marginal actually, because you can do it in the fixed context as well, but how do you set up the reward system so that it induces people to not shirk? And it's possible to set those parameters of the policy, if you will, the tax levels, the fines, et cetera, in such a way that you can avoid that. So, I don't know if that answers your question, but...
But would that be a fine given to the collective?
No. So, okay, no. So, but it's based on the collective performance. So you would say, okay, you collectively met this goal, didn't meet this goal. And so now I'm going to impose a fine on each individual, if you will, that is proportional to the amount by which the collective didn't meet the, because the key in that agricultural context is you don't want to have to monitor individual behavior. So you want everything to be based on just what is easily observable, which is, in that case, ambient water quality. So, but everybody has to face some penalty if the group as a whole doesn't meet it, and the penalty is imposed on the individual in that case. There are contexts where you could impose it on the group, but then the group has to decide how to allocate it across members of the group. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I have two questions. So the first one is about additionality. So when you have a collective fine on the collective results, and in particular when you have payments or quotas that you can exchange, there were problems with carbon mitigation, for example, where additionality was not really clear, and you have actors that initially pollute less than the quota and others that initially pollute more, and it's just a way for smaller polluters to sell some pollution allowance that they wouldn't have used anyway. So it doesn't reduce the final pollution, total pollution. So that's the first question. A second is do you know about a lot of literature that has looked into structural properties of the network, the internal networks, and how this could affect the propagation of coordination and cooperation? In particular, when you have, as an individual agent, you only see part of the network, so this could affect your observed incentive.
So it's really important when you are using rewards, right? Because you want to make sure that you're not paying people to do things they would otherwise have done anyway, right? And so there is, I've actually only started to think about the carbon offset context for this, but it really is also, I think, relevant in that context. I mean, our baseline that we set up in some of these models that that underlie this work, the baseline is such that you have to make sure that you're not paying people just for meeting the baseline that that they would have otherwise. So I agree with you that additionality is important, but it's something, again, that through the incentive structure you can ensure. If you have the right information. Part of the problem with additionality is asymmetric information. When you don't know, what the costs are associated with some particular project, let's say, in the carbon offset context. You don't know what the costs are, so you don't know whether that's something that you really need to provide an incentive in order to induce participation, or it would have happened anyway. So, so that is, I think, a question that's important, but I think in some of the cases, at least that I'm addressing, it's not a big issue, but I think in other cases it could be a big issue. On the network question, I haven't really looked at the internal network of the group other than to think about this distinction between centralized and decentralized groups, right? But do you have in mind that there might be subgroups within the group that are connected by the network? Is that what you're thinking?
I have in mind for big groups that you might not have, you might not have communication from everyone to everyone, for example. And so you have communication only with your neighbors.
Okay.
But your neighbors could be, I mean, if you're growing the network of who's neighbor with whom, a different structure for that network could affect the properties of propagation of that network of behavior. Okay,
so on that point, some of the mechanisms, so this comes a little bit to your point as well, some of the mechanisms, communication is not essential. Because even in a decentralized context, in a Nash equilibrium, if that means something to you, you can still induce first best behavior. So it's not essential that they communicate with each other. So in that context, it wouldn't be, the extent of the network and your channels that you have contact with wouldn't be important. But to the extent that there's a need for coordination, so for example, in the, more likely in the fixed approach, where you're thinking about making sure that everybody's on the same page, which we're going to meet the limit, okay, we're going to make sure we meet the limit, then the communication can be more important in that context. So more so in the fixed reward or penalty context than in the proportional one.
Maybe it goes beyond what you were saying, but I was also thinking of if part of the group sees only part of the collective outcome. So your ambient air quality could be heterogeneous, and when you see the quality of the air in your neighborhood, and you're like, we're doing good, but it might be other neighborhoods might be doing bad, then this is also related to network structure in a sense, but it's about the perception of how close you are.
Yeah. And again, that would depend upon whether your incentives depend not only on what you're doing, but also depend upon your smaller group is doing, but also depend upon what the other ones are that you aren't able to observe. So again, depending upon how you set up the mechanisms, that may or may not be an important part of what creates the incentive for you.
In those domains where group-based incentives make sense, can you say a little bit about how frequently they're being used as opposed to other incentives? Whether that depends on political philosophy or type of regime?
Well, they're certainly being used frequently in fisheries. So there's a lot of use of this in the fisheries context. So that's one context where it's being used extensively. Joint and several liability is a thing. It's a kind of liability. So it was in some sense notorious because it was used in the context of Superfund, and that was one where there was concern about it, but it is an established legal principle of joint and several liability, which is effectively this type of mechanism. The ambient water quality and the ambient air quality standards under the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act, those of course are in place. So those are group policies that exist under those two statutes. So, and there are many examples of collective PES programs as well. So I think the one area where they're not being used as much is the agricultural context. That's one context where I think we've seen a little bit, but not nearly as much as in some of the other contexts I mentioned. Yeah.
Just sort of kind of following up on this, I guess I'm curious to what degree you maybe worked on or know, I think some of the political will behind when these policies are or are not implemented. So I'd be really curious, if there are certain aspects that you think about in the agricultural context where there's pushback, right, from the types of either actors who are regulated, right, against that sort of policy. And you mentioned the contentious nature, right, the Superfund principle, and yet it passed, but then it kind of seems like lack of progress in agriculture. So I don't know if you've done work or kind of speaking off of political.
Well, the interesting thing about Superfund was that the interpretation of Superfund to impose joint and several liability came after the fact. So the legislation was passed, and then the courts interpreted it to mean joint and several liability. So the statute itself doesn't say that, and who knows whether it would have been able to be passed. That, yeah. I think so the context where you have industry-wide regulatory threats, I think is one where, you have regulators who are trying to not be like heavy-handed, and so you're essentially saying, if you can solve this problem yourselves, we won't intervene, we won't impose some kind of a costly policy, but if you can't, we will. The problem with agriculture is that we have very little political will to regulate in the agricultural context, or even to threaten to regulate in the agricultural context. So that's why, I think part of the reason why the TMDL context has not been very effective. And in general, when we look at water pollution in the US, agricultural pollution is still a major source of agricultural pollution. I mean, Eric knows this from Iowa. It's just, because we do not in most states, and certainly not at the federal level, have the political will to do that. So what do? What we do is we use rewards. We have a lot of programs in place in agriculture that subsidize, we used to call them subsidies, but now we call them like payments for ecosystem services. We subsidize farmers to undertake certain kinds of conservation activities. That's where additionality becomes a big question. But the literature, some of the studies on conditionality in the agricultural context show that for some practices, depending upon how much of an incentive a farmer would have had to do it themselves, if they really had no incentive to do it themselves, then probably the payments are leading to additional activity. If they had some incentive, like on some of the tillage practices where the farmers themselves benefit, so they might have invested in those anyway, that's where additionality becomes more of a problem. But it's more from a rewards perspective in agriculture as opposed to a penalty structure.
So we are at time.
Yeah.
Join me again for thanking.
Thank you very much.